Hello, welcome to the channel. My name is Matt. This is Bask in the Story, and it's not very often that I read a book that I think everybody should read. There's normally a caveat somewhere of some group that shouldn't read it, but I've read two books very recently that I think fall in the category that pretty much everybody should read them. First book, yep, everybody. The second book, there is one small caveat, an unexpected caveat of a group of people that I don't think should read it yet. But everybody should read it at some point. So, as part of Nonfiction November, I've read these two books. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Invisible Women by Criado Perez. This book is about the data gap around women and how most of the data we have as a society and we use as a society is based on men. And the fact that we, in many data sets, translate the average human as an average man, and the impact that has not only on women and their lives, but also society as a whole, therefore. And this is a remarkable book, and it's one of those books that you read and you suddenly get your eyes opened about gaps you didn't know. Now, some of the gaps I thought I knew, and it turns out I knew a little bit, but not the whole story. And this continue to fill that in. And this is what I love about nonfiction, that sometimes you get a nonfiction book that can really just make you see the world a bit differently and make you appreciate something you didn't necessarily appreciate before. So let's just delve into a couple of examples. Let's take an example that she gives in this book, and there's a whole host of examples covering a whole range of areas, and I'll touch on a couple just to give you a taster of what you're in for. So one of the examples that I thought I knew about, and I thought I understood, but I only know the surface of, was around toilets. And in some countries, UK is one, we have a rule where you have, in a public building or a work environment, you have to have the same floor space for men's and women's toilets. But if you have a roughly equal workforce, you'll find that generally you'll have more queues at the women's toilets than you will at the men's toilets. And my thought, and part of the issue, is that in men's toilets you'll have urinals, and therefore you have more spots for men to relieve themselves in the same floor space than you will for women. Therefore, you get big queues. But that is part of the story, but there's also a lot more to it that I hadn't thought about. And it comes, there's certain things like women generally spend more time in the bathroom than a man will. And the reasons for that are several-fold. One, obviously, a lot of women, especially of working age, will have a monthly cycle and will have a period once a month, so they'll have sanitary product activity to do in the bathroom, several times a day. So that's going to extend the time they're in the bathrooms. Pregnant women are much more likely to use the bathroom several times during the day than men or other women, because guess what? Babies in the womb put pressure on the bladder, and women therefore need to go to the toilet much more often. There's a whole load of other, and there's others as well. There's a whole load of other reasons why these things happen, and that it led me to think of that just because we've got an equal amount of floor space, is that the right method? And therefore, because we have this data gap, are we making the wrong decisions based on it? So that's one single example of something that I read that I thought I understood why it was, but there was a lot more to it than I understood. There's some other ones which I just simply didn't know. Pick one at random. Let's go. Cars. Cars are designed for men, and the safety aspects of cars are designed on men. And that is because virtually all crash dummies used are based on the average man physically. And when you then put a woman in a car, her chances of, if she's involved in an accident, the chances of being injured and seriously injured are so much higher than if a man was sat in the same place having the same accident. Because the cars are built and designed in that, for men. And, that sort of blew my mind. And the fact that when you do like crash dummy testing, and you put the average male dummy in, and the car gets like a 5-star rating, but then you put the female dummy in, the crash rating drops dramatically. it's just not as safe, and the standard is that you just have to use a male dummy, and as long as it passes with a male dummy, that's fine. What? Unbelievable. And there's so many other topics he covers off. There's things about design, like the size of phones, for instance, or tools, public transport systems and how they're designed. The routes that they take are generally built on male requirements rather than female requirements. It's just absolutely, disaster relief, plans for sub-disaster relief. Again, there's so much covered in this, and it's a fabulously passionate discussion. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by the author herself, and she gives such a wonderful narration and is so passionate about the subject that it really gets you. And it's one of those books where you read it and you go, crap, I didn't know that. And it makes you see the world a little bit differently. And I would encourage everybody to read it. Now, you will find parts of it really frustrating that we don't have the data, or that if in places where we do have the data, yet we're not using it, we're using the male-centric data. It will frustrate you, but it will hopefully open your eyes and make you see the world a little bit differently. For all the frustrations that we have in this world, this is a fabulous book that hopefully brings awareness to an area that I didn't have awareness of, or only very small awareness of. So absolutely brilliant book. I recommend to everyone to pick it up and read it. Superb. So that is Invisible Women by Criado Perez. The second book I want to talk about that I think pretty much everyone should read, and this is the one where I've got a slight caveat which I'll come to at the end, is Entangled Life by Melvin Sheldrake. So this is about fungi. Fungi are weird things where they're not animals, they're not plants, they're a whole separate kingdom. Generally we stick them under the sort of plant badge, but they're not, they're completely separate. There's a huge variety. We don't know a huge amount about them. There's a huge amount to learn. They make up a huge volume of what is life on this planet. The numbers are literally astronomical, and at one point he does compare the numbers and the volume to solar system galactic scales to give you an impression of how many and how much of them there are. But some of the bits I really loved about this book is not only learning about fungi themselves, but the discussion he has about what is an individual and the interconnectedness of species. If I take an example that's not fungi-based, but human-based. So where do we start and end? What is an individual? Now, normally, we would probably just view it as the extent of the body. So where my fingers end and where my toes end and the top of my head. And this is my me. But then when you break it down, how much of me is actually me? And there's actually probably there's more cells or living organisms that are on me than are actually me. So you've got all your bacteria, your microbes, your fungi, your bacteria in your gut. There's just so much living on, in and around you. And yes, it is a bit creepy, and you start to get a bit itchy when you start thinking about it. But where do I start, and where does the other organisms that are living on me start and end? We are in ourselves an ecosystem for a whole variety of living organisms. And then he talks, he brings this to algae as well. And I like the fact that he talks about sort of the interconnectedness of life. He harks back to Alexander von Humboldt, whose book I read, The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wulf earlier in the year. I loved it, which was about Alexander von Humboldt's life. And that was absolutely fascinating, a fabulous read. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it if you have an interest in biology and our views on biology and nature. Superb. Anyway, sidetrack. So taking the interconnectedness of life, he then talks about lichen. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought much about lichen in my life. But lichen is fungi and algae joined together in a symbiotic relationship, creating lichen. But also, they've now gone more research into lichen. They found that actually sometimes there's fungi, algae, yeast, maybe another algae also. And when is it a singular individual and a conglomeration of individuals? And where does one start? When does one begin? We create these distinctions between individuals, and yet the interconnections and symbiotic relationships that exist in nature, in the world, are so intertwined that it is really difficult to separate them. And he goes into fungi, he talks about trees, he talks about the what's classed as the wood wide web, but it's more than that connects many plants together underground through fungal connection. Superb, absolutely fascinating, made me think about the world differently. He also harked back to another book I read this year, which is Braiding Sweetgrass by Wulf Kimmerer, about the language we use and how we, create this language of humans and everything else, when again it's all interconnected, but also about the animate and inanimate. So, he used the phrase, a hill is always hilling, and sort of the verbiage of things, even if they're inanimate, they have some level of agency, I suppose. But it's really, for me, the interconnectedness of life and how it all works together, and actually trying to separate ourselves or any individual part of it, whatever the individual is, part from others, is incredibly difficult, because we are so reliant on all the other species in our environment. If you took away all the bacteria and fungi that was living on me, in me, etc., I wouldn't exist, I would die. I rely on huge numbers of other organisms to survive, and they rely on me. So anyway, fabulous book. So there is one caveat of people that potentially shouldn't read this just yet, and it isn't what I would expect, or wasn't what I was expecting. So if you haven't read Lord of the Rings, I know, quite the tangent. If you haven't read Lord of the Rings and you don't want any spoilers, there are spoilers for Lord of the Rings in this book. They're not major spoilers, but they're certainly spoilers in it. So you are forewarned. So if you haven't read Lord of the Rings and you want to read that, then read that before you read this, but then read this. I know, I wasn't expecting it either. Fortunately, I read Lord of the Rings several times, so I was fine with it. But yeah, there you go. So those two books, Invisible Women, Entangled Life, both superb, both brilliant. I honestly would recommend, I can't recommend them highly enough. They are magnificent, and Nonfiction November has been an absolute blast so far. And that is all I think I have to say in this video. I think I've gushed about these books more than enough. Please do pick them up. If you do, I really hope you enjoyed them, and I hope they sort of brighten your experience and your view of the world and the world we live in. And I will look forward to speaking to you in the next one. Bye.